Thank you, everybody, for making this phone call. This is the monthly teleconference of the Military Civilian Transition Research Forum. I'm Nathan Ainspan, the research psychologist with the Military Civilian Transition Office. It's good to see a good attendance for this group, and good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. If this is your first time on the call, welcome. This is a monthly teleconference that the MCTO office offers. The purpose of it is to give us a chance to listen to the latest research direct from the researchers who conducted the work, so that the research can advise us to improve our policies and programs that DoD, VA, and the other government agencies can offer to the service members and the veterans, with the full intent of improving the programs and services that we offer the members, so that they can have a better and more productive transition in the end. This monthly forum is open to anybody who's interested in the subject matter expert. You don't have to be with an agency or a VSO. We encourage people to join on, graduate students, anyone with an interest. If you aren't on the mailing list, email me. I'll give my email a little bit. Email me your email information, and you'll get 2 emails a month. One will be a hold the date, and the other will be the slide deck and the login information. Attendance is strictly voluntary, so many people will just sign up and get the PowerPoints and the information, and we welcome you to come on the calls and discuss it as well. I also encourage you to send me information that you might hear about when research comes out. If there's any studies that you are involved with or that you've seen, please send them to me so that we can then make them, slot them for monthly calls so other people can be aware of them. We also have some good news, some new stuff right now. Excuse me, let me just try and mute everybody else. I'll be muting everybody, but remember, you can unmute yourself if you wish to speak. Some good news that's coming is we're working with the MCTO LinkedIn page, and a subset of the office's LinkedIn page will be one dedicated to this forum. That will allow us to post all the slideshows that we've had in the past 6 years. So if anyone's interested, they won't have to request them or dig around for them. They'll all be there, and it will allow us a chance to continue the discussion and to share research and ideas. So we're working on the details of that. Keep your eyes open for that. Keep your eyes open for the upcoming sessions that we'll be announcing shortly. If you have technical issues, during the presentation, once they begin, I'll be checking the email. My email address, which you can use to send me articles, suggestions, if you're having technical issues today. And then also, if you'd want any of the slide materials from past presentations, and if you want to be added to the mailing list. Excuse me, my email address is Nathan, N-A-T-H-A-N, .D as in David, Ainspan, A-I-N, S as in Sam, P Peter, A-N, .civ for civilian, @mail.mil, M-I-L, again, Nathan, D Ainspan, .civ, @mail.mil. Email me for more information to get on the list, to share materials, etc. And then if there's any technical issues you may have during the call today. So without any further ado, let me introduce the speakers and turn it over to them. Today's paper represents 4 different institutions and brings together 4 different types of perspectives, ranging from sociology and different forms of psychology to business studies, and brings together, check out the lit review at the end of the paper, a thorough lit review of the research and the science that's out there on the psychological implications of veterans employment. Usual disclaimers that the opinions that are being presented today do not represent the opinions or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the institutions that are listed on the slide deck. Institutions are presented for attribution purposes only. The opinions represented are those of the speakers. And now I'd like to introduce the speakers. We have David K. Sherman, who's a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at University of California, Santa Barbara. His research on self-affirmation has been influential in understanding of the motivations that lead people to engage in defensive biases. He has co-authored a series of op-eds on social psychology and public policy that appeared in such outlets as the LA Times and the New York Times. Erin C.K. is a J. Rex Buca Professor of Management and Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. Dr. K's research focuses on the relation between motivation, implicit social cognition, and social issues. He has particular interest in how basic motivations and needs manifest as specific social and societal beliefs. Alair MacLean is Associate Professor at Washington State University, and she's in the Department of Sociology. Her research addresses questions related to inequality in historical and cross-national contexts. Throughout her career, she has focused on unequal pathways through the transition to adulthood, first examining military service and then more recently, higher education. In this work, she examines the factors that shape the trajectories that people follow in their late teens and early 20s. And last but not least, Stephen Shepard is Assistant Professor of Marketing at the School of Marketing and International Business at Oklahoma State University Spear School of Business. His research addresses how various beliefs and ideologies, such as socio-political or religious beliefs and social issues, intersect with marketing and management. So let me turn it over to the foursome. Go ahead, please. The floor and the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you. And thank you to the Military to Civilian Transition Research Forum for inviting us and having us here. As Dr. Ainspan said, we represent 4 different academic departments: marketing, psychology, sociology, and management and organizational behavior. And the project that we're going to talk about today and the ongoing research originated when our collaborator, Erin K., was giving a talk on stereotyping in another context. And Sean Kelly, who is a Duke executive in residence working with us at the Veterans Transition Research Initiative, and there you could check out the URL, he raised the issue of what social psychology theorizing and the type of work that we've been doing for many years. What are the implications of that work for the military transition, for veterans transitioning into the workforce? And this started a conversation among Steve Shepard, Erin K., and myself about what the theories that we have been studying, theories of how people cope with a lack of control in their lives, how people stereotype others, and how people are impacted by those stereotypes. What impact would those theories have, and what could we learn from studying veterans and the military transition? So the culmination of this paper, the culmination of this work resulted in the paper that you see there. We recognized that our perspective was missing another perspective, that of sociology and expert in the military. And so we joined forces with Alair MacLean, who's a professor of military sociology. And together we've been working for the past several years. And the goal of this project is really twofold: to bring the perspective of psychological science and the theories of psychological science to this important social and societal issue. And in so doing, we are trying to, and this is the second goal, trying to expand the impact of our theories and our understanding of our theories by examining this particular group and this particular set of issues. Today, we look forward to sharing with you the initial research that we've been doing and our ideas about the implications of this research for the transition of military veterans. And with that, I'll pass it on to Steve Shepard.
Thanks. So just to start things off, I think that this quote here just nicely captures the issue that we're looking at, and just some of the challenges that veterans can face when transitioning from the military to civilian life. So this quote from this veteran said that I came home from war only to become lost in the fog of another war. For so long, my comfort zone was being behind a rifle or being in a big armored vehicle. Being home, walking down the street, going shopping, staying at my house, that was well outside my comfort zone. So again, I think illustrates well this this transition from the military to civilian life, and just the stark kind of contrast that can exist during that transition. Just different ways of living, different culture, different norms, everything about daily life can be considerably different. And so basically, in this paper, we wanted to identify just the general factors that might contribute to some of these challenges that veterans might face. And so, as David suggested, we took a interdisciplinary approach and basically came up with these 5 kind of general factors that seem to be contributing to this issue. And it's not necessarily exhaustive, but certainly I think captures some of the major issues that veterans face. And so things like trauma during service, self and military selection, these are probably the most well-studied issues, and Alair will be talking about these in a little bit, and she's certainly done lots of great work in this area. And then these other issues, so socialization in the military, self-stigma and stereotype threat, and discrimination. These are 3 factors that we identified as potentially playing a role, and certainly there's some work looking at this, but probably less studied than other factors, and it's certainly less studied by social psychologists, despite these being issues and kind of just general areas of study that are very much in the domain of social psychology. And so David and Aaron and I, being trained in social psychology, saw lots of opportunity to contribute to just understanding these issues using theories that we work with. So our approach here, it very much reflects this quote from Kurt Lewin, who is often cited as the founder of social psychology. And he said, "There's nothing so practical as a good theory." And so this is kind of the approach that we're taking. This idea that by starting with theory and having a good theoretical understanding of different phenomenon, that theory can lead to insights, and then those insights can be leveraged in order to come up with potential solutions for these problems. So that's basically where we're coming from with this research, and I think now we'll turn things over to Alair, who will talk a little bit more about trauma during service.
Yeah, so as we've laid out, we think of the post-military service as being influenced by these 5 overlapping circles. And the first of those is trauma during service, which is something that may happen to a veteran that's unique to military service that then has longer term impacts on their employment prospects. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I've done on this topic, looking at the impact of combat. And this comes from a piece that appeared in 2010 in the American Sociological Review that looks at the association between combat on the one hand and disability and unemployment among US men on the other. And the research is based on survey data that comes from the panel study of income dynamics, which is a common survey that economists and sociologists use. And it's a longitudinal survey that's been collected since 1968, and fortunately has questions about military service and combat exposure in it. So what I did was I selected the male heads of household who and focused on them just in the prime working years. And doing this, I get veterans who go all the way back to World War II. And in that sample, the bulk of them are non-veterans, but there's a hefty share of non-combat veterans, veterans who said they didn't experience combat, and also combat veterans. The question, the veteran question that is asked in the survey is, did you ever serve on active duty in the military service? And the combat question, which many people have debated, but is the question they asked, is, did you fire a weapon against the enemy or come under enemy fire? And so the point here was I wanted to look at the diversity of impacts on disability and unemployment, and how people who experience kind of that trauma that we think of as happening in combat, how they might differ for disability, which is a physical or nervous condition that limits the type of work or the amount of work you can do, and unemployment according to the formal definition, which is I ask you, were you working last week? And if you say no, then I say, were you looking for work? And if you say yes, you were looking for work, then you're classified as unemployed. And in the paper, I compare those people who are classically unemployed to people who just weren't working. So if you just take the data going up through the early 2000s, stretching back to 1968, and you compare the combat veterans to the non-veterans to the non-combat veterans, you can see that the proportions reporting being disabled among combat veterans are pretty much always higher, except with a couple of exceptions, than both non-veterans and non-combat veterans. And in fact, the non-combat veterans are less likely than non-veterans to report being disabled. So next slide. That's disability, which is, as I described. If you look at unemployment, which is really the thing that we're interested in this paper, which is what are the impacts of service on workplace outcomes, you'll see that for the most part, there's some fluctuation in that unemployment proportion, but combat veterans, again, are more likely, both the non-veterans and non-combat veterans, to be unemployed. And these are observed proportions. So what I do then is I create models where I look at both the measures of combat and non-combat veterans and take account of the fact that they have different racial characteristics, different educational characteristics, different family structures, and then to array them by age. And if you do that, what you get is a model that predicts by age the odds of being disabled. And again, based on these model results, the combat veterans are more likely, both than the non-veterans and the non-combat veterans, to be disabled. Interestingly, the non-combat veterans are less likely than the non-veterans to be disabled. And we can talk about that a little bit. I don't want to take up more than my time. And the other last thing that I did for unemployment was to look at variation across different eras, because we know research has shown that people serving in different eras have different outcomes. And you can see that within the Vietnam era, those who served during the Vietnam era, the combat veterans are more likely to be unemployed at every age than the non-combat veterans, and similar for Korea. So to sum up, just we need to consider the heterogeneity of the experiences that veterans have and how that affects their trajectories in the work life after they leave military service.
Great. So with that as a broader context, one factor that we considered in our paper is the total experience of being in the military. That is the socialization that comes with being in that immersive culture. When veterans are discharged, they need to potentially adjust to a very different organizational and corporate world. The working together for a common goal that's central to military life may lead people to think about work differently. And the meaning of work may be importantly different in ways for veterans and non-veterans. So drawing on work from cultural psychology, we were interested in whether veterans may have different motivations for work than non-veterans. And this is a project with a graduate student, Lauren Artosky, here at UCSB. We conducted a study with almost 400 participants, 200 of whom were military veterans and almost 200 of which were non-veterans. And we asked them simply, from the following list of 12 reasons why people work, pick 6 that are most important to you. Which of these 6 are the most important reasons for why you work? We're really trying to understand, are there any differences? And are those who had military experience perhaps more motivated by different factors? And some of those factors, the ones on the left in blue, are what we term more collectivistic reasons for work. So being a role model, bringing honor to a person's family, and helping family or giving back to the community. On the right are more individualistic motivations for work. So learning more skills, exploring my potential, expanding my knowledge. And so we looked at the proportion of veterans and non-veterans who each picked those different motivations, the more collectivistic ones or the more individualistic ones. Okay, so along the y-axis is a proportion chosen, and in orange are the collectivistic motivations, in green the individualistic motivations. And we see first that overall people were very motivated by those individualistic motivations to expand knowledge and skills and so on. But for veterans, more so than for non-veterans, they were more likely to be motivated by the collectivistic motivations, that is, being a role model, helping one's family, relative to non-veterans. Now, we don't know exactly why this difference occurred. That's something Alair will speak to in a bit when she talks about selection factors and who goes into the military. But it suggests that veterans may be looking for different experiences in their jobs. And it certainly seems plausible that coming from a more collectivistic, tightly knit military context helps shape the perspective of veterans as they head into the workforce. Well, this led us to think about how veterans think differently about their military experience and their civilian organizational experience. This is a model that was proposed by Stone and Stone, the model was developed to understand the factors that affect hiring decisions about veterans. Some of these, such as the stereotypes that employers have about veterans, Steve and Aaron will talk about in a little bit. But other factors, such as the perceived organizational fit and the match between organizational culture, we thought were interesting to think about from the perspective of the veterans themselves. And in particular, we're interested in the aspect of military life, that it comes with a very well-defined and predictable, and in some cases, rigid hierarchy. The rules are very transparent and the norms are very clear. That is, in military life, there's a very strong structure that goes to when people get promoted, what the day-to-day job is like. And this can contrast with civilian and organizational structure in interesting ways. And we want to look at what is the impact of this distinction. Okay, so this is a study that we're conducting with graduate students Connor Gibbs and Lauren Artosky here at UCSB. We conducted the study online, and the question that we asked was, how do military veterans perceive the structure, both in the military and in the first civilian organization where they worked? And what psychological outcomes are associated with these perceptions? And this work is drawn from compensatory control theory. The theory proposes that people try to maintain control over different aspects of their life, and they can respond to threats to control or a loss of control by trying to compensate and seek ways of asserting control in other parts of their life. We describe this in the paper and the implication this has for the military transition. So in this study, it was a correlational study where we measured a number of different factors. We measured the perceived military structure that they said. So to what extent do you agree that the military provided a clear and structured everyday life for me? And then we had them reflect upon the first civilian organization that they worked at. Most of the veterans, the average age was about 38 or 39, and it had been almost about 9 years since they worked at the organization. But we asked them to reflect on that, identify the organization, and think back to their experience there. To what extent did they agree that the rules in the organization were clear? We asked the same questions about the military and that first civilian organization. And then we were interested in potential outcomes that could be associated with those perceptions. So to what extent did the veterans feel as though they had efficacy at their job? That is, they felt like they could do what they needed to do at that job. So items such as, whatever comes my way in my job, I feel like I could handle it. And to what extent do they feel as though they belong at the organization, that they feel as though they fit at this particular first organization they worked at? Our idea was that potentially those organizations where people saw a greater structure, for veterans, this made them lead them to feel as though they had greater efficacy. It may enable greater workplace efficacy and consequently a greater feeling of belonging. So first, consistent with our intuitions, the veterans reported that they perceived much greater structure in the military than they did at the first organization that they worked at. Okay, but obviously there's a lot of variability in the perceived organizational structure at these. And how is that variability associated with these outcomes we are interested in? Okay, so in this figure, along the y-axis is how much efficacy they felt at the first job, and along the x-axis is the amount of organizational structure they felt at that first civilian organization. And the positive slope indicates that for the veterans who perceived greater organizational structure, they felt like they could handle what they needed to do at that workplace more. On the flip side, when they perceived that there wasn't much organizational structure, they felt much less efficacious at work. And we see an even stronger relationship for the relationship between the perceived organizational structure and their feelings of belonging at the workplace. When they didn't perceive a lot of structure at the organization, they felt as though they didn't belong. But when they perceived more organizational structure, perhaps more similar to the military experience, they felt as though they belonged in those organizations to a greater extent. Okay. So this line of work is very much ongoing in an active line of research in our laboratories, and we're interested in building on this. But what it suggests is that examining veterans' perceptions of structure can lead to theoretical insights and advances. One of the purposes of the Perspectives article was to show that taking the example of military veterans and their transition can shed new light on existing theories. And in this case, it helps us understand potential linkages between organizational structure and facets like belonging. This also has potential implications for onboarding practices. There may be roles for more experienced veterans in communicating the structures that exist in an organization to new hires. And some of our ongoing research are examining these issues, as well as the generality of this phenomena to non-veterans, looking at heterogeneity within the military veteran community, and importantly, looking at issues of causality. Of course, this study was a correlational study, and we're interested in whether there's a causal role for organizational structure in leading to these positive outcomes. Of course, questions of heterogeneity raise issues of what led veterans to go into the military in the first place. And for that, we'll turn back to Alair MacLean.
Yeah, so we've been talking so far about things that happen to you while you're in the military. And one of the questions that always comes up is, how do the people who are in the military differ from those who didn't have military service? And is that possibly what's driving any outcomes, any differences between veterans and non-veterans that you see after service? And the reason this is so important for military service in particular is that there is an element of choice on the part of the individuals who decide in the all-volunteer force since 1973 to join the military. And then there's an element of choice on the part of the institution. The institution is selecting on the basis of characteristics ranging from health, education, test scores, and criminal background. So next slide, I can show the model of kind of how we think of the way that people come to serve in the military. And this is a model that I've used in a number of different articles. Being a sociologist, I think a lot about ascriptive characteristics that people are born with that they don't have control over, their gender, their race, their family, social status, and how those are associated with, on the one hand, their educational background, how they do in high school and grammar school and so on. And then how that relates to what sociologists call the transition to adulthood. And for the purposes of thinking about the military, we can think about in a very broad sense that the transition to adulthood, early adulthood, gives people three choices. They can join the military, they can enroll in college, or they can enter the labor force. And here I'm sort of focusing on what we would think of as traditional enlisted people who serve in the enlisted ranks. Those are shaped by the choices that they have are shaped by the historical context. And the historical context shapes the types of standards that the institution has. And I just throw this in here so you can see that the outcomes that veterans experienced in different cohorts in the workforce shifted and were different across different cohorts. So this is a comparison. On the y-axis, you have the $1,000 of earnings among veterans and non-veterans. And then on the x-axis, you have the age at which the veterans are measured. And this is a very standard finding in the literature that among those who served in World War II, or were eligible to serve in World War II, veterans actually did better in the labor force than did non-veterans. Whereas if you go down to the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that among those who served during the early all-volunteer force, they initially had higher earnings, veterans did, than non-veterans, but they lost that advantage over time and then ended up earning less. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about who selects into the military in the most recent era. And this is based on research looking at a longitudinal study of sophomores in 2002 that were followed all the way up through 2012, and asked questions repeatedly about what they were doing. And what I do in this paper is I look at those who said they had served or were serving in the military by 2012. So that is 8 years after they were seniors in high school. And these are contrasted with people who said that they had no service but had enrolled in higher education at some point, versus those who said they had no service and no higher education. In some cases they were working, in some cases they were not. And so this is a way of looking at who selects into the military compared to who selects into other different pathways. And the predictors that I use in this paper are parental SES, which is socioeconomic status, a composite of parents' education, parents' occupation, and parents' income, race and ethnicity, their college expectations, their test scores measured when they were in high school, gender, region, urbanicity, pretty standard set of predictors. And what I find in the paper is that socioeconomic status of parents is the biggest predictor of service for men. The men in the middle two quartiles were the most likely to enlist in the military. This goes against one of the things that was kind of an initial impetus for the paper, which was looking at the contention that there was a poverty draft during the early years of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. That is, that only poor people were going in to serve. The race and ethnicity for that time period did not predict service for men, but it did predict service for women. So African-American women were more likely than white women to enter the military at that time period. African-American men for that time period alone were not more likely than white men to enter the military. And that's actually a kind of a finding that's been shown in other research as well. The other thing, so I mentioned that we're looking at, I'm thinking of how family background affects whether or not somebody goes into the military. So that is your class background being a predictor, but also looking at these questions about motivation and achievement, which might also predict military service. And those who expected to go to college when they were sophomores in high school were less likely to join the military than those who did not. And those with higher test scores were also, actually, there's a curvilinear relationship between test scores and military service, with people entering the military clustered in the middle, those at the bottom being kind of cut out by military standards because you can't go in if your scores are too low, and those at the top most likely deciding to go to college. And so, to sort of sum up for this, it's a question that always comes up is, to what extent do the outcomes that we see after the military stem from things characteristics that people had before they went into the military? And so that's kind of where we why we include this as a consideration. Now, having discussed the variability within the military service, we're going to turn to something that all veterans face after they leave, and that is the potential of being stereotyped because they are veterans.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about some of our research that we've done on this issue of just how veterans are potentially stereotyped and discriminated against in the workforce. And so, yeah, this is in a paper that we published in 2019, where we look at just trying to get a broad view of the kinds of stereotypes that exist about veterans. There is research that exists kind of looking at stereotypes in maybe a bit more of like a piecemeal way, or identifying specific stereotypes, specific instances of stereotyping. But we think that by using theory, we can kind of get a broader view and make some predictions about the kinds of jobs that veterans will be the kinds of domains and jobs and industries where they'll face some disadvantage because of particular stereotypes that exist. So again, we basically look at how veterans are stereotyped simply by virtue of being a veteran. So going back to this kind of model we have of these 5 overlapping factors, certainly stereotypes exist about disability, and we've seen a little bit about trauma and disability among veterans. Also discrimination based on gender and race, but we wanted to look at just the label of being a veteran. How does that shape people's views of a person? Again, looking specifically at how this might impact employment. And so this quote here, I think it reflects a side of veterans that people perhaps don't think of as much, which is the rich or complex emotional lives that veterans can have. I think people forget this about veterans sometimes, and this might be shaped by culture, cultural representations of veterans in the media, for example, how we just talk about the military in society, and these kinds of emotions, being maybe suppressed or not dealt with or not shown. And so I think people can forget that veterans have emotional lives. That was kind of my observation anyway, and so that's what I wanted to look more at, and actually how I saw veterans being presented and just I think thought of by people is pretty consistent with research that looks at how we understand the minds of other people. And so lots of great work by Kurt Gray in this paper here, Shining Gray, nicely covers their model where they look at just how do we understand the minds of other people. And so their model basically looks at these 2 different factors, agency, so the ability to plan and act and to carry out intentions, and the ability to feel things, so feel emotions and sensations. And so there's certain things that we think of as having more agency, other things as having more capacity for feeling. But what they often find is that there can be a trade-off between these different types of dimensions of mind that we ascribe to people. So they often find that when someone is presented as agentic, or we're focused on someone's agency, we tend to kind of forget that they have feelings. And likewise, when we're more focused on people's ability to feel and have sensations and emotions, we kind of forget that they have agency. So, Superman's a good example, and superheroes. We don't think of superheroes as being hungry or thirsty, right? That tends not to be what we focus on. Animals, if you have a dog or a cat, we might think of them as being able to feel pain. Same thing with children. We think of them as being able to feel sensations and very driven by sensations and emotions, but less so capable of planning and carrying out intentions. And so I thought this fit actually the kind of stereotypes about veterans quite well, and just people in the military in general quite well, where we emphasize as a culture their heroicism, their ability to act, to have a plan and carry out that plan and have intentions. Basically, you have a plan, you follow that plan, and you do it, and you get it done. And so I thought that basically this might come at a cost of by focusing on their agency, maybe forgetting this other side, that they are full human beings that have emotions and feelings. And so we wanted to look at these stereotypes and then also look at its implications for employment. So with this first study on the next slide here, we basically just presented people with a basic description of a person. And that person was either described as being a combat veteran or not. Everything else was the same, held constant, the name, age, just kind of other superfluous information. And basically that person was rated on different traits. And so just drawing from past research, agency being measured on traits like self-control, memory, the ability to plan, have intentional thought, and then feeling being measured with items like hunger and fear and pain and pleasure. So how much can this person experience these things? And so what we found is that you can see that for the veteran target, the person that was the veteran that was being rated, they were higher in agency and they were rated as lower in the ability to feel compared to the non-veteran. And we find this kind of effect in a lot of different contexts, a lot of different ways of describing a veteran, different roles in the military, different comparisons, male or female, things like that. So it seems to be pretty robust. So again, this is sort of initial evidence of this trade-off between this seeing veterans as being agentic but not particularly feeling, and they were also seen as more mechanistic or robotic, which is consistent with a particular kind of dehumanization where you see someone as being able to do things but not really feel things, like a robot. So this view of veterans, I think it actually fits very well with the reasons why employers don't hire veterans. So when you ask employers, why they don't hire veterans, you see the same kinds of things coming up. And the ones that fit particularly well with the stereotype are things like fit with corporate culture, interactions with other employees, being too disciplined, or being concerned about rigidity, right? So all of these are issues of either being sort of too mechanistic, I guess, too agentic in a way, and not having enough feeling, basically concerned about social interactions, concerned about their soft skills and things like that. So then, what kinds of jobs will veterans be seen as more or less suited for? And this is important to know too, because if this stereotype applies to the labor market and the kinds of jobs that veterans are seen as more or less suitable for, one of the implications is that veterans will be seen as suitable for jobs that just require doing stuff and not really dealing with people or emotion. And this is a problem because over the past several years, you see this trend towards focus on empathy in the workplace, on soft skills, on being able to interact with other people, emotional intelligence. And then meanwhile, jobs that are just based on kind of rote procedures, they are being outsourced or lost to automation. So again, these are just some of the issues that we're facing here. And so again, we wanted to know what kinds of jobs veterans would be seen as more or less suitable for. And so in this other study, what we did is we presented people with different descriptions of jobs, and we used an existing framework for categorizing different jobs into the kinds of work that it involves and the kinds of skills that it requires. And so veterans were seen as best suited for what are called realistic and conventional careers. And so these are careers that involve kind of following rote procedures, working with tangible things, not really working with other people as much, following orders, following procedure. And we also found that these were jobs that indeed required more agency over feeling. And then you can see this decrease for social and artistic jobs. So these are jobs that require working with other people, interacting with others, understanding emotion, expressing emotion, things like that. These kinds of jobs that require feeling over agency. Veterans were seen as relatively less suited for those kinds of careers. In another study, what we did is we looked at things at the career level. So we got 100 careers, and one sample rated those careers on how much feeling they require, how much agency they require. And then another sample, they were shown just a random set of 10 careers, and they were asked to rank them according to how good of a fit a veteran would be for this job. And so what we have here is this pretty clear relationship between the amount of agency that a job requires and its fit with a veteran applicant. So here it's ranking. So on the y-axis, the lower number is a better fit. And so you can see that these jobs that really require much more agency over feeling, construction manager, supply chain coordinator, computer programmer, veterans are seen as fairly suited to these kinds of careers. And then these other careers that are much heavier on kind of the feeling, social, emotional side of things, mental health careers, personal care aide, veterinarian, as just some examples, they were seen as less suited for those kinds of careers. Now, in this next study, we wanted to see if people who actually work in jobs that where they might be in a position to hire a veteran, so people in human resources, managers, supervisors, we wanted to see if these kinds of beliefs that we observed will also apply to them, or if they correct for any of these kinds of biases or perceptions. And so in this particular study, we presented people with a cover letter, and the cover letters were the exact same across conditions, except in one condition, it just made brief mention, just 2 or 3 sentences about being in the military. In the other condition, it was the exact same wording, just they were a volunteer for a nonprofit overseas, but everything else was the exact same. And the rest of the cover letter just focused on their education, training, experience, and then we asked about their suitability for different types of careers. So for the version of the cover letter where they talked about their training and education and mental health, and they were asked about suitability for mental health careers, you can see that the veteran applicant was rated as less suitable for these mental health careers compared to the non-veteran, even though the resumes or the cover letter was the exact same. And you can see that the veteran was seen as suited as the non-veteran for these technology careers, again, careers that don't require that much, as much ability to kind of feel or understand emotion and socialize with others. And so again, I think this is a good illustration of the stereotype in that you have this cover letter that's the exact same, but just having those 2 sentences about being a veteran seems to impact people's perceptions of the applicant. And we find this again with another sample looking at restaurant employees. So we partnered with a large restaurant chain, and their employees at different levels in the organization looked at a resume. And again, you have a veteran or a non-veteran resume. All the extra kind of superfluous information is the exact same. It's just a matter of, did they describe having some military experience or not? And then they rated the applicant's fit for different positions in a restaurant, how likely they would be to succeed, their potential to excel, things like that. And what we found was that the veteran was seen as a better fit for jobs like a dishwasher or prep cook. Again, these kinds of more rote procedure jobs that don't require as much interacting with other people. And they were seen as less suited as a server. And in another sample, we found that they're also seen as less suited as a host at a restaurant. So again, less suited for these kinds of jobs that require interacting with others. So having established this effect, we wanted to then kind of leverage this to develop some kind of maybe intervention to help reduce this bias. And so it follows that if people see veterans as lacking emotion or this ability to feel or empathize or understand others, then if we just communicate that to people, then that might help undo the bias. And so in this study, we showed people a resume for either a veteran or a non-veteran, and the resume either included information about volunteering at an animal rescue and working with animals and so helping socialize the animals and care for them, or it didn't have that information in there. And then people were told that this person's interested in event planning, and so some of the jobs in this context were described as the kinds of jobs that are fairly kind of rote procedure, just require agency, so like ordering things and just making sure that things are organized the way that they should be, or these other kinds of tasks that require these emotional or soft skills. So, choosing a venue for a client based on the atmosphere that they're going for. So kind of understanding the kind of emotion and feelings of another person. And so people rated this applicant's suitability for these different things. And so for these more agentic, low-feeling tasks, people saw the veteran as suited to do that, and actually more so than the non-veteran. But then what we found for the tasks that require more feeling, on the next slide, you can see that just in the baseline resume condition, the veteran was seen as less suited to do these kinds of tasks, and was also seen as having less emotional intelligence and lower in empathy as well. So we got those ratings. But when the veteran's resume also included this extra information about working at an animal rescue and working with animals, you can see this undoes the bias, and now the veteran is seen as equally suited to do these kind of high-feeling tasks as the non-veteran. So this was some indication that understanding these stereotypes can maybe help us design interventions, in this case, fairly simple intervention for veterans to communicate the kinds of skills that people might stereotype them as lacking. So I will turn things over to Aaron now, where he'll talk a little bit more about the implications of this work.
Thanks a lot, Steve. So just to touch on some of the implications here, what I want to touch on is some of what I think we could take away from these findings specifically, and really this approach that Steve outlined more generally. So first, at the broadest level, what these findings suggest is that a psychological approach might be needed to address veteran underemployment. Recognizing that vets are often underemployed, most interventions have focused on trying to help veterans better communicate and translate their military experience to potential employers. But if much of the problem comes from erroneous stereotypes people hold, this sort of skills translation probably won't solve the problem. Stereotypes act like an interpretive lens, leading people to see past experiences and intangibles in ways that are consistent with the stereotype. So to combat this, we need to think hard about what the stereotypes look like and where they're coming from. One important insight from the work Steve just presented is that the stereotyping process might not be as simple as military vets are unqualified or incapable. That is, they might instead be laden with what are seemingly positive content that tells people what types of jobs vets seem more suited for. Not necessarily that they're just incompetent overall, but here's where their strengths lie. Now, a positive stereotype like this still has the consequence of funneling veterans into some careers and away from others, just like an overall negative stereotype would. But positive stereotypes can be harder to detect because they feel to the perceiver like what they're doing is benevolent or driven by good intentions, or based on their belief about what this person would most enjoy. Now, how do we solve that problem? Well, one, awareness of the process can help. So uncovering and showing these effects happening, like Steve and I did in the research that he described, is one way to do this. But what we really need is a very full understanding of what drives these stereotypes, where they're coming from. And more generally, are there ways in which people who have the best of intentions are unwittingly propagating stereotypical beliefs about veterans? One important factor to consider here, and one that we're pursuing now, is how the language surrounding vets as heroes and warriors might lead to some problems when it comes to employment. But in general, what's needed is a very thorough examination, like scholars have done with race-based stereotypes and gender stereotyping, of the context and conditions that make people more likely to perceive veterans according to a stereotype, rather than as unique individuals with a range of skills and various interests.
Okay, so veterans know about these stereotypes. Some of the things that we talked about earlier, such as the stereotype that all veterans suffer from PTSD, or that veterans are aggressive, or other stereotypes, the likes of which Aaron and Steve just discussed. And so how does that knowledge that they could be stereotyped in different work situations affect what types of jobs they're willing to apply for, and how they experience the workplace? So this part of the research that we reviewed in the paper draws on work by stereotype threat. And the idea of stereotype threat is that people are impacted by the mere knowledge that they could be judged as a member of a stereotyped group. And this happens for all people in all different types of groups. So it could be for senior citizens driving and knowing that there's a stereotype about seniors and how they drive. It could be a stereotype about academics and how we interact when we're interacting with non-academics. And if we know that we're going to be judged as a member of a stereotype group, it changes our behavior, and it's something else that we're thinking about. And this is also related to academic performance, and this is where the work originated by Claude Steele and colleagues. The mere notion that I could be judged as a member of my stereotype group, and if there's a view in society that, for example, women don't succeed at high levels of science, well, that's an extra cognitive burden that I could have. So, how relevant might this be to a veteran who is moving into a new organization after leaving the military? What are the potential impact of stereotype threat on military veterans in the workplace? We think that this is a really interesting idea, and tell me if you think that this idea applies in the context of veterans. So research in other domains finds that people who are under the potential threat of a negative stereotype, who think that a negative stereotype could apply to them in a given situation, they become vigilant for cues that their actions or abilities are being evaluated as a member of that group. So might veterans be vigilant for the possibility that they're being judged as a member of that group, that the stereotypes are applying to them? Well, other research has shown that one impact of potentially being stereotyped is a feeling that I don't really belong in this organization. And indeed, other research by military psychologists and colleagues has found that veterans report this idea of this experience of social exclusion, or feeling as though they don't belong in certain civilian society and organizations. Might the knowledge of stereotypes and the stereotypes that could be applicable to me as a military veteran be responsible for some of this sense of a lack of belonging? And might it further affect their performance on the job or their experience in the workplace? A large study found that veterans score lower than matched non-veterans on many indicators of workplace satisfaction. The idea here is that potentially one reason for dissatisfaction in the workplace might be the knowledge that you could be impacted by being a member of a stereotype group. So, a lot of the research in stereotype threat has identified the impact of stereotype threat, and a lot of the research that we've been involved in has also looked at interventions that can attenuate this impact. This figure is drawn from a paper that I worked on with Joel Brockner from the Columbia Business School and was published last year. And we reviewed the literature on interventions in organizations. In particular, how do people get impacted when they make a big transition and experience some sort of transitional threat? Again, think about a veteran who's moving into a new job place, and it raises questions about whether or not they belong, or how do I understand the systems that work at this new organization? What we propose is that interventions can be applied at two different levels. One can be at the level of the worker themselves. You could do things that might shape the interpretation of the worker as they're entering into a new workplace. And indeed, interventions that have experienced people talk to newcomers about how things get better or how you become to understand the situation or the organization more have been effective at easing workplace transitions. And so we review a number of these, what we call construal shaping interventions that could affect the individual. But as well, interventions can be at the level of the organization, kind of from the bottom of that figure going up. And these structural organizations, perhaps the types of which that Aaron and Steve described, where different types of jobs or different types of jobs are described differently or appeal to others differently, or different aspects of the organization themselves can be shaped in such a way as to mitigate stereotypes and potentially mitigate their impact within the organization. So this is a really rich area, and this is really where we're looking to go, to apply the theories from social psychology and other fields to this particular issue and work with organizations to help to develop potential interventions to improve the transition of military veterans to the workplace. And now I'd like to pass the mic back to Aaron we'll wrap things up.
Okay, thanks. Presume you can hear me this time. Yes, okay. So thanks a lot for listening. You know, in the big picture, what we're trying to do, what we're hoping to do is to take very new ideas and theories within the social sciences, particularly within social psychology and sociology and organizational behavior, that have been developed in large part to help understand processes of discrimination and selection and disadvantage and inequality in other domains. But just because it hasn't been on the radar of people in our field, we're trying to have these theories be applied and be enriched and to help understand the employment issues as they relate to veterans as a sort of a social category. And so if you can move forward a slide there. I just want to be clear, and you know, we're getting a lot of support for this research. This has all come in some way mediated through Sean Kelly and now through other people who Sean's introduced us to, but our research has been supported both by Microsoft and by Amazon. That support's been invaluable to us as we are running a lot of studies right now, trying to collect data on these issues and trying to understand from a lot of different dimensions, from the perceiver side, that is the hirer side, and from the veteran experience, what can be done to help veterans get employed in a wider range and a more successful range of different dimensions. And so if you want to contact any of us or have any questions about any of this, there's our email addresses. We're all very Googleable. Also, I mean, we could have added Sean up there too. He's a big part of the VTRI now and working with us. And so you can reach out to Sean as well. And so thank you very much for listening. And we're happy to whoever can sit around and want to ask some questions, we're happy to take questions. And otherwise, I think this was called for 2 to 3, so I'm sure some people have to go. But thanks again very much, Nathan, for organizing this and for having us and for spreading word about the work.
Yeah, thank you guys for presenting and for jamming a lot into the 1 hour. We are running late. If people are willing to stay on, we can certainly keep the channel open for discussion and questions. If we have to jump off, totally understandable. We'll announce the recording and where we can find a place to put it so you can catch up there. Thank you everybody for being on. Soon we'll be sending out the announcements for the March call that we'll have. And just as a tip off for April, our tradition has been the past number of years that as soon as the DOL Employment Veterans Situation Report comes out, we'll soon have a phone call after that to have the DOL person walk us through the numbers and what they represent, how they've changed in past years. And in March, we're looking at a presentation on how the media portrays veterans. There's a little bit of a follow-up for the study here. To start the questions, the first one, is Googleable a word these days? And then number 2, you mentioned some of the techniques that have been seen in the literature for other populations on reducing the stereotype threat. And you mentioned like veterans can emphasize if they weren't working in a dog shelter, it sounds like they should actually like list soft skills that they may have used like while they deployed or while they held a leadership role in terms of the organizational changes, what has worked for other types of diversity in other populations. Short of telling Hollywood to start doing better movies that portray veterans other ways, is there things that could be done at a macro level to get the change hearts and minds? Over.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly, I mean, what we draw from mostly when we try to answer those questions is, like I said, a large amount of research when it comes to the people of color and gender discrimination situations where you would see a lot of inequality, and then you see people trying to overcome it through structural interventions and changes. The most successful things that have worked so far when things are driven by stereotypes, at least within organizational settings. David can talk about educational settings where they've had different types of success, but in organizational settings, what needs to be done in those contexts are systematic changes that are either cueing to applicants and employees who should be there, what kind of people are there, And we've done work on different, language that's used in job ads and different cues in the environment that suggest a type of person that's assumed to exist there. And there are lots of structural interventions that they use now. And then the other type of structural intervention is things that are related to the blinding of the hiring process, basically removing the capacity for someone to be able to stereotype by removing that information from resumes. So there's software out there right now, for example, that if you're at an organization, when people apply to you, you can run your applications through this software. It will blind them to the degree they don't just take the name and the gender off. They take out anything on those applications that suggests something about that person that isn't relevant to their skills. So it would take off what college they went to, any cue of their socioeconomic status, any cue of their gender that might come from something else. There are things that are out there that are trying to do that, but it's an exploding area of research right now because of what's happening culturally. And we're going to try to keep an eye on that and apply it to this space the best we can.
Have you seen if one suggestion I talked about is really focus on, KSA's knowledge, skills, abilities, and competencies, and like lay them out in the job description and encourage the person to address those and to focus the hiring decision on that? From the
so those same pieces of software will allow you as the hirer to put the skills you want for a position on the left of the screen, and then on the right of the screen, it will take CVs or resumes or cover letters and just turn them into those skills and just let you look at the two side by side, removing all identifying information. So there's attempts to that. It's not specific to the veteran space, and it shouldn't be. Those aren't widely adopted yet because the problem is people believe that if they just learn about a stereotype, they can overcome. They'll just won't do it any longer. That's been a big problem with pushing some of this stuff. Is a resistance for a manager to tell their hiring staff that, we have stereotypes towards veterans or towards women or whatever it is. Just stop doing it. And there's some sort of belief that works when of course it doesn't.
Interesting. Yeah, there's the studies on the implicit bias. That people will still carry a little bit around.
Yeah, I don't know if in the implication slide, if Steve talked about the implicit bias training as sort of a model solution that's out there now to a lot of this, but it's frustrating because it doesn't. There's no good data to suggest it works. If anything, it just licenses people to feel like they've dealt with it.
Any questions from anybody out there? Okay. Great. Again, thank you for putting your email addresses up. I encourage anybody on the group to reach out to the speakers to follow up any further additional questions. Any parting comments from the floor and from the speakers?
Thank you.
Yeah, we just want to thank you for the opportunity to present our work, and for those who are in this community and attend this regularly, please let us know of relevant work and your feedback, and we look forward to keeping the dialogue going.
Same here. Thank you for arranging to get everybody in one place and one time across the time zones. Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Stay sane out there. We'll see each other again in a month, and take care and have a great weekend. Be good, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.